You've written that the word feminism came into use in 1912. Talk to us about what feminism in 1912 meant as opposed to feminism after suffrage.
The word actually was formulated a little before that. There were some uses of it in the 19th century, but in the U.S., you start seeing it in newspapers and magazines around 1908, 9, 10, 12. 12 was it. And what women using it meant was that they were talking about a revolution in women's and men's lives that would be more than simply the vote. That the vote stood for basic full participation by women. That was crucial, that was part of it. But feminism meant freedom for women to be their subjective selves, whoever they wanted to be, that they were not adhering to a certain model of womanhood that these younger women typically saw as this is woman with a capital W, as if there was one model of womanhood everyone who was going to be respectable should adhere to. They saw that as the previous generation's modes of behavior. They wanted economic freedom. They wanted to be able to have jobs of their own choice. They wanted sexual freedom, really. I mean, most of these women were not talking about living with a man outside of marriage, although a few did. But they were talking about the ability to play the field sexually before marriage, to have equalitarian marriages, to enunciate the fact that they were sexual beings and would seek sexual pleasure.
So are we now talking about women of the middling sort, middle class white women? We're now talking about working class immigrant women many of whom would have given their right arms not to have wage work. In other words, who didn't see wage work as freeing, but who saw wage work as confining. And African American women, I would think the same.
Well, I think some of the aspects of feminism when the word began to be used in the teens were less about economic self-definition than they were about other sorts of social and sexual freedoms. And there were immigrant working class women who participated in that set of feelings. It was a zeitgeist, really. Women have wants, women want to have fun. It was a kind of early version of that. And it was about heterosexuality. It was about no longer saying we subject ourselves to sexual pressure by men because that's the way life is, or marriage has that in it and we want children. It was that we want to have sexual freedom, we want to have more ability to define who we are. And yes, I think the theorization and the real ability to enact this model, particularly if it involved seeking higher education, seeking an interesting career, was limited to a small group of fairly privileged women and intellectuals, really, as much as anything else, women who had some access to wide reading, cosmopolitanism. But I don't think it was absent altogether from wage-earning women, and certainly not from black women. I mean, in Harlem, among the more avid readers and writers in the Harlem Renaissance, certainly this ethic of subjectivity, self-definition, and sexual and thinking realms prevailed, I would say.
But there, of course, you're talking about the 1920s.
Yeah.
Right. So,
but I think it really does begin in the teens. But for a fraction that is hard to define, because it's not strictly defined by economic level, although certainly the most degraded in terms of poverty, are not going to have that freedom. But I mean, look at Anzia Yezierska,
Yes, I was actually just thinking
there's the freedom of the mind, and those women who got enough education and were desirous of more reading, they could be exposed to ideas at the time that could make them think otherwise. Whether they got to act on those lives was a question of how many constraints kept them.
Yes, Anzia Yezierska is a great example because she's an immigrant, a person who comes as a young person, as an immigrant from Poland to the U.S. Her family's the poorest of the poor, but she what she wants to do as she keeps writing is, I want to make myself for a person, is how she puts it.
Yeah.
And by her standards, that's sort of becoming whatever she wants to be. So in her fiction, she, tells us the story of her 3 sisters who get married off by her father, but she's not going to let herself do that.
Now, it's not as though there were no women of that sort in the 19th century. I mean, you look at the heroines of George Eliot novels, or that
but even real people like Ernestine Rose.
Oh, sure. Or look, I'm thinking of someone more in the generation we were just discussing. Look at Rose Pastor Stokes.
Yes.
Now, there is a woman who, in the very early part of the century, she decides to be a free woman. Now, she marries, and then she gets much more access to wealth. Or Margaret Higgins Sanger, who is born poor. And so the environment mattered. Being in New York mattered a lot. In a diverse environment, I think, where people were located, whether one was in a metropolitan area or not, made a huge difference. The ability.
So switch now then to 1920, let's say. Suffrage has been achieved. How does the notion of feminism change? How do women now begin to imagine themselves?
Well, I think some part of that group that had been militant suffragists becomes much more interested in questions around birth control and become birth control activists. Some become much more internationally interested and want to go out and explore the world or apply ideas of equal rights for women to the rest of the world and become international feminists and link with women in Latin America, let's say, or in farther afield. But domestically, it's a time of tremendous turmoil in feminism because a split occurs between those who support protective labor legislation for women workers and those who believe in an equal rights amendment that would wipe out all differences between women and men on all the books of all the states.